Santa Barbara Historical Museum. So nice to have all of you here, especially in honor of Neal Graffy speaking, which we love. So if you do not already know Neal Graffy, I just want to tell you briefly about him. He is an accomplished author and historian. He's written several books and monographs, including for the museum, including our signature book, which is sold out, Historic Santa Barbara. Active in our historical community, he served as a board member of this museum, on the County Landmarks Commission, and as president of the Santa Barbara Chorale of Westerners, I think multiple times. I don't know what they would do without you, Neal. He served just recently as guest curator for our exhibition about the 1925 earthquake, along with our exhibition Project Fiesta, Santa Barbara News Press edition, where we were able to highlight our recently curated and acquired archive of Santa Barbara News Press photos. It was dedicated to his sister, Erin Graffy. And I'm sure we're working on like at least 6 more projects with him in the future. So please continue to send in those donations, become members, and everyone, my friend Neal Graffy.
Thank you, Dacia. And so what I like to do is take a picture of the audience. Oh, happy history. Okay, there we go. Santa Barbara, California. Beautiful place, a nice small community. It was actually a place at one time that was a pain in the butt to get here. There was no harbor. The land was locked up at the Gaviota Pass. The ocean came over, coming in from Ventura. So it was a miserable place to try to get to. And yet, somehow, it has attracted people here for thousands and thousands of years. And it's an odd place because, first off, we have a south-facing coast, which is unusual on the east and west coast of the United States. We also have a range of mountains that run east and west, which is highly unusual as well. And we owe its natural and its man-made beauty to disaster, being mainly earthquakes and giant flooding. And we have collected the oddest assortment and weirdest assortment of characters and incidents, continually leaving their mark on our history, and some of them leaving their names on our streets. And this is what got me interested in putting together the street names of Santa Barbara. So many places I visited, it's A through Z, 1 through 50, names of trees and names of presidents. And so I was intrigued with why Santa Barbara had these great names like this, and so I started investigating it. There's a number of books that have been printed. Rosario Carrillo did Pathways to Pavements in the 1950s, and I found that all these different histories of Santa Barbara street names were slightly different here and there. So I started investigating it, and what I did, I went back to 1851 when the streets were named to try to get a feeling of Santa Barbara. I got old maps, I got old journals, and started researching things. And I thought I was really smart because to translate some of the Spanish into English, I got an 1851 Spanish-English dictionary over at the Mission Archive Library. And so I still had some of these words that made no sense. And one of the longtime volunteers here at the museum, Frank Armendaris, he said, "Neal, you have a Castilian dictionary. That's what was spoken in Spain. In Mexico, they did not speak perfect Castilian. And what they spoke in Mexico was not what they spoke in Santa Barbara." And I went, oh, just like when you're in Boston or you're in Texas or you're in Missouri, you ask for a soda or you ask for a pop or you ask for a Frank, and you're going to get different things in each one of those places. So I realized, aha. So we threw away the dictionary and started working with some of the longtime Spanish speakers, and so we got some of the things straightened out from that. Okay, so how do you build a house in the New World? It's Columbus has been here, the Spanish have come here, there's all this empty land, and you want to build a town. Well, it's not as easy as you thought. The King of Spain, at one point in 1523, 1533, he came up with a book called The Laws of the Indies. And this was a book that had 148 ordinances in it, which would have made Santa Barbara really happy, all these ordinances. And it told you exactly how to build a town in the New World or anywhere else. There was definitely laws that you had to go by. And so what it said is that you first have a public square in the center, And then you put a church at one end of the square, you put the government buildings at the other end of the square, and then you build squares out from that. And the squares are perfect for a family, and then as your family increases, you subdivide, so you can see you get a quarter of a block, a half a block, or an eighth of a block. And so that was the idea. They also said, take into account before you do anything which way the wind blows, because you make sure you want to have your slaughterhouse downwind, and so you don't have that. Don't do your laundry, find a place below your city, do the laundry, do all the cleaning, infectious diseases, you do it down there. Let the people at downriver suffer from you. Don't do it above river. I mean, in a way that was so explicit for things that you would think were common sense. It's sort of like, in my idea, if you remember back in the 60s and 70s, the Idiot's Guide to Complete Volkswagen Repair. It was anybody out of VW had that book. So this spelled everything out. So everything is told you exactly what you need to do and how to do it. So you would think that Santa Barbara, which is so planning oriented and prides itself on its planning for so long, would have followed that. But we didn't. We started off as a presidio, as a fort, not as a pueblo. And in our case, the presidio was built primarily for defense. And so they built it far enough from the ocean that ships' cannons couldn't reach it, and also so that there was a wide plain on all sides so you could see enemies coming. And so it was built primarily for defense. As the presidio expanded and people started leaving the presidio, they started building homes outside. I would have thought that perhaps they would have followed the laws of the Indies and simply built outside the presidio walls and built squares and circles and done all the correct things. They didn't, because they built by necessity, where there was good soil, good drainage, and where they could find water. So we had absolutely no plan. But this picture here, which is not very much to scale, the guy was, at least he gave us a map. This shows the presidio, and we're standing just about dead center where that big white blank thing is. That's future De La Guerra and Santa Barbara streets. And this does show 3 roads in Santa Barbara. This is the first street map of Santa Barbara. And there's one road that heads off there to the left that says Para el Embarcadero, and you can see a little anchor at the bottom. And that means that's the road that goes to the place where we load and unload ships. That's loading and unloading spot. The other one is the road to San Buenaventura, and then the one at the bottom along the ocean is the ocean road to San Buenaventura, which connects with the other one. So we had 3 roads in 1820 for Santa Barbara. Well, with people just building adobes as they saw fit, this is a map from the 1850s, and all those little black dots that you see are houses that people have built around Santa Barbara. Since there was absolutely no order to the town, somebody came to here and wrote, "It looks like Santa Barbara. Somebody went up into the mesa with a blunderbuss filled with adobes and fired it out over the town, so wherever they landed, that's the town." But by 1850, the free-range adobe period was going to be over. So this is Santa Barbara in 1852, 53, and you see a row of trees there to the lower right. That's future De La Guerra Street. The building at the just in from the left side is Figueroa Street. And so that's pretty much what Santa Barbara looked like. And it was about to change because in April of 1850, the California legislature said to incorporate as a town, you must get a surveyor and you have to have the means and bounds of the town recorded and everything laid out and surveyed. And what is fun about that to me, the oddity that is still Santa Barbara, is that it's March of 1850. California is not a state until September of 1850. So before it's a state, we have a state legislature telling communities, you have to do these things. A month later, they incorporate Santa Barbara. We haven't got a surveyor. We have done absolutely nothing, and now we have incorporated as a city. So I just like it that all these things happen despite the rules that they said they were going to call for. So Santa Barbara needs a surveyor. So they put out, in December of 1850, the town council says, all right, we're going to get a surveyor. We're going to put out a call, and we'll get everybody, and we'll wait 6 weeks, and we'll pick a surveyor. 6 weeks pass, nobody. 9 weeks pass, nobody. And I figure, well, one thing is, how did they advertise this? There were 6 papers, if that many, in all of California. And I've gone through them, and there's absolutely no advertisements for Santa Barbara needs a surveyor. Not even a polite mention of Santa Barbara needs a surveyor. Going through the town council records, I couldn't find a payment for a printer, should they have found a printer, which I think San Francisco had printers. No bill to a printer to print up a pamphlet or anything to say Santa Barbara needs a surveyor. And I looked on Facebook and they didn't post anything on Facebook. Nothing posted on Facebook, so how they called for a surveyor, I don't know. But after 9 weeks, this gentleman showed up here. This is Salisbury-Haley. And Salisbury-Haley gets a really bad rap in Santa Barbara history. The South Coast Beacon wrote this about him, that Haley Street was named after a ship captain who, sorry about this, who was the only bid for surveying the city. He did so inaccurately and skipped town. Haley Street began its humble life as a street in the early 1850s, abandoned by its namesake. It's possible that Captain Salisbury-Haley would have reveled in his street's ill repute. For decades, rowdy bars lined Haley Street. After all, he was a sailor and the kind of man whose shabby grid layout of our city led to disputes and litigation. So that's what Santa Barbara knows about Salisbury-Haley. Salisbury-Haley was born in New Hampshire in 1812. He took the sea at a very early age and was soon running ships up and down the East Coast. He moved down to the Florida Keys. He was known as a master mariner, and that means that no matter what the type of ship he had, wherever he was going, he had the ability to pull the ship in himself and dock it. You know, when you're on a cruise ship, you pull into a port, they always bring the little dinghy aside, and the port captain comes aboard and guides the ship into port. Yes, what was that, Molly? Coastal pilot. So Haley did not have to do that, so he was highly regarded, noted master mariner. He had a wife and a child. The wife died, and his child went to live with the in-laws because he was out at sea all the time, so I guess that didn't work out. 1849, with the call of the gold rush, he came to California. He crossed the Panama, then came up to San Francisco. Next, find him in Stockton. He's only been here 2 or 3 months, and he's already been elected to the California State Constitutional Convention. So he's going to be one of the guys that's going to draw up the laws in the Constitution for California. He doesn't get the job. Something happened, and so somebody else took the job. Then he next shows up here in Santa Barbara as a surveyor. And so he takes the job, and the job that they ask him to do is to take this open plain of Santa Barbara, and you are going to measure it from the ocean front up to the Mission Garden, and then from hill to hill on either side. So between the Mesa, the Riviera, the ocean, and the Mission Garden. And within that, you're going to make streets that are 60 feet wide, except for 2 principal streets that will be 80 feet wide. And each block that you design will be 450 feet square. And so he starts off to do that. Now, there's been a lot of history written that Haley, why didn't he align our streets to the compass? We're offset for the compass. We don't really go north. When we say we're going east on a street, we're not really going east. We're going a little northeast. So whenever you're giving directions to people, you have to explain, I'm using street compass or I'm using actual compass, so they know which way they're going. And, well, here's how Haley laid out the streets. The town council told him to do it. And this is what they told him. On February 1st, here's what they told him. Let me try that again. They said that you're going to start at a place a few yards east of the usual landing place. The usual landing place, so where boats row ashore, covers a wide territory. A few yards is not an exact measurement. So the red line that I have there down at the beach is a few yards from the usual landing place. And you can see the road that drops off to the bottom there. That's the one that we saw, the road to the Embarcadero, where the anchor was. So that's more or less the landing place. And you go up from that point up to Isaac Sparks' store, a yard from his lower southeast corner of his store, and then go from there over to Judge Joaquin Carrillo's house and to a point that's 2 feet of his door side. And so that red line follows that. So that's the first principal street that the city has also laid out for him to follow. The next street at cross angles to that will be along Judge Joaquin Carrillo's porch. So that's the next line that we have, which will become Carrillo Street when it grows up. So that's where he starts, and he starts at the corner of State and Carrillo as his starts doing all of his measuring. So here's a little close-up of the green square at the bottom is Isaac Sparks' store, and so you can see the edge of State Street coming along his property. And then across the street at the upper left there is Judge Joaquin Carrillo's place, and you can see that the street runs right around 2 feet. You can see it's exactly 2 feet from his doorknob. So they laid that out really well. Now, how did Haley take this survey? Well, he had a surveyor's chain. A surveyor's chain is 66 feet long. It has 100 links that are 7.92 inches long. And so you stretch it out, measure 66 feet, you put a marker, then you go more feet, then you mark off how many you want till you get to 450 feet for each block, and you go 60 feet for each street, and onward you go. Well, the story is our streets are not 450 feet, or our blocks not 450 by 450, but all of our streets are 60 feet as they were laid out. So the story was that the problem was that Haley had links on his chain that were worn. Now this is a link, it's not that big, and do you think the wear mark on that is going to result in feet of mismatched measuring? I don't think so. The other part is that there was broken links that were held together by leather. Walker Tompkins speculated that the story of the leather was because in the mornings it was heavy and wet, and so the leather would stretch, and in the afternoons it was hot and dry and it would shrink. So that's why nothing ever measured up from Haley's survey. Well, I, being the kind of person I am, I went to the extant newspapers and tried to find what the weather patterns were for California at that time, and it failed at that endeavor. But once again, playing with leather just for the fun of it, it does not stretch that much to make a measurement go off by several feet. As Haley is doing his survey, he has 1,412, I counted them, survey stakes. So at the corner of each block, he pounds a stake into the ground, 18 inches, and it has a number at the top of the stake so he knows what the blocks are. So the blocks are numbered starting up at what is now Mission and Laguna Street. That's block number 1, going all the way over to the west side to block number 15, then back over to Laguna for block 16. So that's how the blocks were all laid out and numbered. So Haley starts working in February, beginning of February. By the end of February, he tells the town council, I have finished the survey, I'm now going to make a map. And on April 1st, around there, he gives the map to the city, and they say, great, survey's done, and they pay him, and he's happy. Haley's original map has not been found. There was a lot of lawsuits over the years, and I know that they were argued up in Sacramento, so the map is probably up in the California State Library, but nobody has found it yet. 2 years after Haley did the survey, a man named Vitus Wackenruder came to the city and said, I will draw the maps based on Haley's survey that shows where all the property is, because there was a problem of these new streets and blocks cutting off people's property. This map here, you can also see the compass point, north and south and east and west at the upper left-hand corner. So you can see, had Haley built it the way people think he should have, north, south, east, west compass, to get to the mission, you'd have to go sideways, up, sideways, up, sideways, up. So it would have been ridiculous to try to build to the compass point. So our town council did it right, directing them where they went. There's a big empty spot on this map, and so there's the close-up, because that's where the bulk of the town was, between Figueroa Street, Guerra Street, and Santa Barbara, and it says Vineyard, but that's De La Vina Street. So these are all the houses, and you can see the ones that are in the ways of the streets. So this is Vitus Wackenruder's close-up showing property owners. So now the city knows where people's buildings are that are in the street or property, and we've got to compensate them for their loss of property. And with the mistake that was made on Wackenruder's map was he does not have what we call a monument. So anybody that's ever done a survey, you need a starting point, a monument, so you would take your type and go from there. So technically it should be at State and Carrillo Street. What Wackenruder did was he just went to Haley's stakes as they were pounded into the corners, and so he measured all the property within a block. He had nothing to do with the monument. So when the lawsuits started hitting the city because people started building thinking their block is 450, so a guy starts at one corner and he takes 50 feet, this guy takes 50 feet. As they start subdividing, coming to the section, they find either they've got 3 feet that they can't figure out what it's doing there, or they're short 3 or 4 feet. So there's lawsuits back and forth about that. But the California courts ruled that the city of Santa Barbara had accepted these maps as the official maps of Santa Barbara, and they said once you have made an official map, you cannot change that. You just can't sit there and erase everything and start all over again. Now, part of the Haley thing that intrigues me is, let's say between Sola and Mitchell-Terena Street, that a block is, instead of 450 feet, it's 448 feet. Well, every single block between Micheltorena and Sola is exactly 400 and whatever I just said, 48 feet. So there was a method to his madness as to why some blocks were not exactly 450. The one thing I noticed is that when no, not that part, that one. When we went up to the Mission, at Mission, between Mission and Pedregosa, it's a full block. I went and measured everything exactly 450, 60, 450, 60, and found that he would have had a third of a block by the time he reached Mission Street. So he adjusted things, and one of the things that we don't realize is how many creeks, how many large boulders were all over the landscape of Santa Barbara. So I think that sometimes he adjusted something here and here so that the street intersection would be clear as it passed these giant boulders or a creek bed or something else. So that's the end of this part. And now we come to the next part. And on February 22nd, 1851, the city said that they would to get a committee to name the streets. And unlike today, they simply said, these three gentlemen are going to be the guys that name the streets. They didn't have a meeting to decide when to have the meeting, and then another meeting to decide who should be at the meeting, and then a meeting to decide when they should have the meeting, and then pay $500,000 to an out-of-town consultant to name the streets. So, which, anyways, that's what happens. So instead, we got these three gentlemen, and so on the far left we have Judge Joaquin Carrillo. He was in the previous town council in the Mexican period, which they call the Ayuntamiento. He was a councilman, as it were, during that period. After the Americans came in, he was on the new town council and also was the mayor for a while. He was also a district judge, and he was never overruled, supposedly, and he did all of his rulings in Spanish. He never bothered to learn English, or at least if he did all his court transactions in Spanish. Antonio Murillo de la Guerra was the youngest son of Jose Antonio de la Guerra, the gentleman who was our commandant for the Presidio for many years. He built the beautiful house on De la Guerra Street that is still with us. He was also on the town council. He was a secretary during the Mexican council period. He was the mayor of Santa Barbara. He went on to being a state senator. During the Civil War, he led the only Spanish-speaking cavalry unit from California that was on the Union side. And so he had quite a long and distinguished career. Eugene Lees, I don't have a picture of him. He came to California in 1847. He could speak French fluently, English fluently, and Spanish fluently. Very quickly, he became a translator here in Santa Barbara. And then he also translated for the state of California. Every year they published the laws of California in English and in Spanish, and he was the gentleman that translated Spanish to English and vice versa. He served in the state assembly, and he also was very fond of adult beverages, to the point where at one point he was given custody of the notorious outlaw and highwayman Jack Powers. Since Santa Barbara didn't have a jail, he was in the custody of his attorney. And so Mr. Lees went out to get a drink and said, Mr. Powers, on your honor as a gentleman, would you mind staying here while I go out and get a drink and I'll bring back a bottle? And Jack Powers said, on my honor, I certainly will. It turned out Jack Powers was not a gentleman, and by the time Mr. Lees got back to his house, Powers was long gone. And there's ads in the old Santa Barbara Gazette, the first newspaper, from Eugene Lees saying, anyone knowing the whereabouts of Jack Powers, please let me know so I can get him back in court. Well, so these three gentlemen, unlike other cities that were doing A to Z, presidents, trees, etc., they looked at our town, they knew the history, they knew the people, and they came up with a brilliant 52 street names for Santa Barbara. So here's the blank canvas that they started with, and there's a lot of places that were known by their natural geological features or other such features, like where there was somebody's garden, oh, Garden Street. Where there was somebody's vineyard, oh, De La Vina Street. Where there was a salt pond, Salinas Street. Wherever roads led to or went through, they got names like that. We also have Milpas Street, where there is a cornfield, and that was Milpas. Laguna Street. A laguna is a small lake. It is not the lagoon. There is no such thing as a lagoon. It was a small lake like Laguna Blanca and Hope Ranch. So Laguna Street went through that little lake. And so they came up with names like that. But then they also had to figure out, well, we have a lot of streets, so here's all the streets that we have. And you can see there's a little dot there, a blue dot in this just above center. That was the Laguna, the little spring-fed lake. And then the large estero down below it. So one was the estero, one was the Laguna, and it was not called Estero Street, it was called Laguna. Okay, now we come to part of the magic of these guys. So the bottom of the map is the ocean, and the top of the map is towards Mission Street. So what they did was all the streets that you cross as you come into this community welcomes you with the names of the governors, the Chumash, the pioneer families, and other interesting characters. And so that way you get to know everybody. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but they also didn't group everybody together. There's little spaces, you can see where I very carefully colored between the lines here, and you can see there's empty spaces where other streets cut through. And that's because those streets were important for a natural function or reason, and so they thought that was a better name than putting another person there. The blue line is for Haley. The green lines are for the Chumash, Yananale, and for Valerio. And then we have the governors. Now they had a choice of a lot of governors. They had like 9 Spanish governors, 14 Mexican governors, 7 American military commanding governors, and they only chose 5 to put on our streets. And they didn't put them in order. I would have put them in order by the years that they governed, but they spread them out, and I don't know why, but it was their brilliance that did it. I won't argue with that. Now, only one street led from the ocean all the way through the city to Mission Street, and that street was named for St. Barbara. It led from the channel of St. Barbara, St. Barbara Channel, all the way up to the Mission. And so only one person got that honor to lead you into the town. That was until the city council came up and the planning department came up with a modification for Garden Street about 10 years ago. So they erased the toehold of Santa Barbara Street touching the ocean, and now Garden Street bends and takes that spot. So they cut off St. Barbara, and I'm sure that her wrath will descend upon us in no time at all for doing that. Yananale, this was the first drawing of Santa Barbara done in 1793 by the George Vancouver British expedition coming through California. And I did a close-up because you can see the Mission in the distance, not the Mission we have today. The Presidio down at the bottom, and then to the left you can see the little yellow dots being the Chumash huts on the village of Siyuktun, which is on the beachfront between Bath and Chapala Streets. Mr. Yananale was the chief of the Siyuktun village, and he had, when the Spanish came here in 1782, he helped them build the Presidio. He gave his Chumash people as volunteers, not volunteers, they got paid to help the Spanish. And so he was rewarded with a street, and his street leads right to his former village. So that's why Yananale Street got placed where it did. The other Chumash person whose name comes up is Valerio. Now, Valerio Joseph was born at Mission Santa Barbara at the Indian village up there, and he didn't like living, as he got older, did not like living at the Mission, so he escaped. And at times he was brought back and said, you can't run away, but then he would run away again. And eventually he had spirit helpers that rendered him invisible. And so he would sneak into the Santa Barbara Pueblo at night or up to the evil Mayor Domo at Mission Santa Barbara, and he would steal things or borrow them. And the legend is that he took all these rich things and gave them to the poor peasants throughout Santa Barbara. So he was like an early Robin Hood. Well, in 1827, he killed another Indian named Wenceslaw, and his spirit helpers left him, and so he was now vulnerable. He was tracked down by Chumash guides and Spanish soldiers, and he had a cave up in the mountains where he hid all of his loot, and no one could ever find him because he could turn invisible and jump over bushes and things. But without his powers, they found him, and they had a brief fight, and he was killed. He was taken to Mission Santa Barbara and buried at the Mission Cemetery. And the Spanish fathers at the Mission didn't think too kindly of his ending, and they said that he was murdered by the Chumash and the Spanish soldiers. So they thought that could have done better with him. But Valerio Street, where they put it, makes sense because it points to the foothills where Valerio's hideout was. And to this day, no one has yet found the canyon or the crevice where that was his place was, but supposedly if you find it, it's full of gold, silver, and other things. So that's how we got Valerio Street. What most people kind of forget about is the west side, which also has some colorful streets. We have them marked in green and brown. The green one on the far left is Gillespie Street, named for Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie. The first brown street is Chino Street. Chino Street is named for the Battle of Chino, and it was taken at the Chino Ranch, the Rancho del Chino down in Los Angeles area. And in July of 1846, as the Mexican-American War was started, a bunch of Americans, or foreigners as they called them, were sent down to the Cajon Pass to look for General Castro coming through with his army. And so there's 20 of these guys, and General Castro took a different route, and so these guys were sitting there bored to tears. So they went down to the Rancho del Chino, where their friend Isaac Williams lived, a 22,000-acre ranch, plenty of room. So they're having a good time at the ranch, and then 100 Californios come by and go, well, there's 20 guys over there, and so they were at odds with each other, so they started shooting at each other back and forth. Isaac Williams says, I got 3 kids here this is my family home. I got 3 kids. You got to let me surrender and get out of here. So they let him go. But then, since everybody was actually related to everybody else, all these Americans and foreigners had married into the Mexican and Spanish families. So everybody's throwing rocks and shooting at each other, and they're all related. So they all sort of just said, well, why don't you guys surrender? There's 100 of us. There's 20 of you. So the foreigners surrendered and were taken to Los Angeles as prisoners, which really wasn't much because they were just back with their families again. But that was the first battle in California of the Mexican-American War, and so Chino Street takes its name from that. The next street over is San Pasqual, and that was the Battle of San Pasqual just north of San Diego. And that's where Gillespie comes in, and San Andreas Street, the other green street. San Andreas Street means St. Andrew, but the actual person was not St. Andrew, it was Andres Pico, but so highly regarded they elevated him to sainthood when they named the street for him. Lieutenant Gillespie had been assigned by President Polk to travel through the south of the United States, go through Mexico, come to the coast, and then come up to San Francisco and report to the American consulate there everything he saw in Mexico, because they were getting ready to start this war with Mexico. So he was really a spy gathering information. He ended up running into Fremont and joined Fremont's men, and then at one point he was then taken to Los Angeles and put in charge of the Los Angeles. The Americans took it over. But he was such a little hard-assed about things that the people of Los Angeles then, who liked him at first, then threw him out because he was running martial law that was just too tough. So he left there, went back with Fremont, and then ended up down in San Pasqual. And at this point, a General Kearny had come in from Arizona, was coming in through San Diego, and a force Andres Pico was head of Californios. They met on the battlefield. Kearny's men had been marching for 2 weeks. Their gunpowder was completely wet, and they foolishly charged Pico, thinking, well, they're just going to run away. Pico's men, the Californios, were superb horsemen, and they also were armed with these long lances. And they were superb fighters, and they just really shredded the Americans. The battle was turned because Gillespie, severely wounded, he'd been lanced several times, had a lung punctured, but he crawled up to a cannon, mounted it, lit it, and the cannon went off, and everybody dispersed, and so he saved the day. So the Americans claimed credit because the Californios withdrew. The Californians claimed credit for the battle because they killed quite a few Americans and lost very few of their own. So that street, San Pasqual, is now part of our West Side history. And Andres Pico gets a street. So he and Gillespie, who are actually foes, became friends, but they both get a street named for them. Andres Pico was so highly regarded that after the war he was elected to the state assembly, he was elected as a state senator, and when the Civil War came along, he was asked to lead Civil War troops by the Union, and he said, I'm just too old for this, and so he declined due to ill health, but highly regarded both by the Americans and the Californios. Oh, there's the Battle of San Pasqual and Andres Pico. I carried on without the cute picture of the battle, and you can see the long lances of the Californios and Andres Pico up to the top there. Andres Pico was also technically our last governor. His brother Pio Pico who actually established the capital of California, was in this room for about 2 or 3 days as Pico was leaving Monterey and heading down to Los Angeles and then to Mexico. And so he had his last conference here in this room and then left, and his brother Andres Pico, as being the military commander, then became the acting governor of California for just a few days, but nevertheless he gets added to our list. Okay, do you speak Chumash? How many people here speak Chumash? I guarantee that most of you speak Chumash every single day. What street did you just drive in? It's a clue. It's a one-way street heading towards the ocean. Who drove on that today? Anacapa. And then if you were coming along above Anacapa past the courthouse, what street were you on? Anapamu. So this is what Anacapa is in the Chumash language. It's like Anyapak, something like that. I can't do it right. John Johnston and Ernestine de Soto, my love, would have pronounced it perfectly for me. But you can see the different names that it went through over the years. In 1854, because of all the odd street names, the city finally said, let's get one name and get it figured out. So that became Anacapa. Anacapa, or Anyakapa, in the Chumash language means mysterious, ever-evolving, ever-changing. And that's Anacapa Island, because if you look at it, some days it's one island, some days it's two islands, and some days there's no island. So it's ever-changing and misting. All the histories say that Anacapa Street was named because it points to Anacapa Island. Well, being the person that I am, I drew all the lines. And Anacapa Street points to somewhere in the channel between Port Hueneme and current Anacapa Island. And so I did the math and I looked at things and I figured that, we have those two large continental plates that are moving, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. Anacapa, since 1851, has moved 34 miles from where it used to be, which means in about 75 years it's going to be steaming into San Francisco Bay. Anapani, which becomes Anapamu Street. In the Chumash language, that means the rising place. And if you can't do it in the car, but if you're ever on a bicycle, go to Milpa Street and head up to Santa Barbara Street on Anapamu, and you realize how steep it is. Or go down to Coda Street and take Laguna, take Garden, take Salsapuedes, and you realize how steep it is coming up. So that is the rising place. And in 1908, they planted a lot of Italian stone pines along Anapamu Street. And thanks to them, the roots are pushing up the sidewalks and streets. And so Anapamu remains a rising place even to this day. Carpinteria was when the first Spanish expedition came through California. As they approached what is now the town of Carpinteria, they saw a bunch of Chumash carpenters building boats, and so the soldiers called it, this is the place of the carpenters. And so the name Carpinteria is with us from 1769. And since Carpinteria Street was the street that pointed to where you take the street to go down to Carpinteria, or the road to Carpinteria, so that's why Carpinteria Street got its name. Voluntario. Okay, how did we get voluntario? Well, looking at the map, looking at the far right, you can see a little blue speck there. That's the salt pond, which is now the bird refuge. And you can guess what street led to the salt pond? Salinas. You guys are doing very, very good. The little brown hill next to that is now the Santa Barbara Zoo. And then there's a piece that says Cerritos de los Voluntarios, the hill of the volunteers. And I know what you're saying. Neal, there's no hill along there. I know that place. There's no hill. Well, there was a hill, and it has changed over the years. I very carefully colored that hill here in green for you. If you stand at Port Lamar and the boulevard and look into the city, you'll see that there's a nice slope along there. It was a bit steeper back in the day, and so this is a view from the Clark Estate looking at it. And if you go to the Carrillo Pavilion and you want to go up to the boulevard, you realize you've got to climb up all those steps. So that shows you where and how this hill was. It's now disguised because we've got so many buildings and trees and grading, but there's still a hill there. Well, why did it get its name? Well, in 1818, Argentina was trying to get its independence from Spain, and so they hired a French naval admiral to be a admiral for them. So he was a mercenary of some will or a privateer, but mainly in Santa Barbara we know him as Bouchard the pirate. And he actually wasn't a pirate, he was a paid mercenary privateer. So he was employed by the Argentine government to attack any Spanish ship, any Spanish port, or any place with a Spanish flag. So in 1818, he's coming up, he's got 2 ships, he's gone to Hawaii, he shanghaied a bunch of sailors out of Hawaii, heads over to California, Spanish territory, fair game, and he attacks the capital of California at Monterey and sacks and burns it, heads down the coast, goes to the Rancho Refugio, where the Ortega family has their place, which has long been a smuggling place. So that's Refugio that we have today. He anchors there, torches and burns down the Ortega Rancho. But these Presidio soldiers are aware he's coming up, and so they took 3 of his men. They captured them, brought them back to Santa Barbara. So he comes down to Santa Barbara, anchors off. Now, because these ships don't have motors, they have to anchor about a mile to a half mile off of shore. So they have plenty of ways, if the wind comes up, they can get away from and not be blown ashore. So he's anchored that far off and sends one of his men aboard. He gets in the rowboat, comes to the beach, puts a note on a stick, and goes back to the boat. De la Guerra, the commandant of the Santa Barbara Presidio, goes down, picks up the note, and it says, "You have my men, give me back my 3 men, or I will sack and burn your town like I've done everywhere else." De la Guerra goes, wow. Decides to stall for time. This guy, Bouchard, has 2 ships, he's got 60 cannon, he's got 300 men. We have about 20 men at the Presidio Santa Barbara, and it's ill-equipped, and there's maybe about 20 or 30 other people that he can count on that can pick up a rifle or a sword. So what De la Guerra does is he writes a note and says, "Love to help you, but I've got to consult with the governor, Governor Sola, from whom we have a street. However, because you have sacked and burnt Monterey, Governor Sola is currently in hiding somewhere out in the boonies, and we don't know where. But as soon as I hear back from the governor, we'll get this settled out." Guy comes back, gets the note, rows back to the ship, gives it to Bouchard, and Bouchard is furious. Bouchard writes a note saying, "Surrender or I'm going to burn the town." Sends the guy back out again. I'm sure the guy's tired by now. And De la Guerra writes a note that says, "My men are as willing to fight and die and defend my town as your men are. So bring it on, Frenchie." So while all this is going on, Bouchard is noticing something on the west side, on the east side of Santa Barbara. He's seeing all these guys coming over the crest of this hill, and they've got swords, they've got guns, and what he doesn't know is the same 20 to 50 people. They're going over the top of the hill, they drop down into the gully, they change their clothes, wait a couple of hours or even days, come back over the top of the hill again. So Bouchard thinks they've got reinforcements now, this is not going to be well. So Bouchard says, he writes another note, guy rows ashore, and it says, "I've got a prisoner from Monterey that I picked up, and I will trade you my guy for your guys, and we'll just call it peace, and I'll be out of here." And De la Guerra says, okay. De la Guerra was actually a little upset because the guy that Bouchard picked up in Monterey was pretty much the town drunk of Monterey. As the town is emptying, he's saying, the bars and taverns are empty. This is godsend. So he was the only one in town when Bouchard came in, so they picked him up. So De la Guerra wasn't too happy about that trade. And I think that one of the 3 chief people that De la Guerra had, one of them was named Joseph Chapman, who had a great history in California. He stayed behind, did not go off with Bouchard. So peacefully, Bouchard left, went down to San Juan Capistrano and torched and burnt that town, and then went off into the pages of history and down the coast further. And so they called this place the Hill of the Volunteers because that's where these guys came over the top of the hill and down. Now, if you look at a map and draw a line, you'll see that Voluntario Street, should it have crossed 101, which it did at one time, leads right to that hill, so that's why Voluntario gets its name. Once again, it's where streets led or passed through that they took their names. And at the far end, we're going to go to the very bottom there in the center where it says Point Castillo. Now, a castillo in Spanish is a castle. It can also mean a small fortification. And so after maybe about 10 years after Bouchard left, the Presidio decided to put a fort up along the mesa there with cannon that looked out over the landing spots along West Beach. And so they built a little castillo up there, and they put a couple of guns up there, and So that's why it was called the Castillo, and so Castillo Street was the closest street to where that place was. So to take the road to get to the Castillo, we have Castillo Street. In 1844, a Frenchman, Duflos de Maufray, came to California, and he wrote a 2-volume book about everything he saw coming through California. What he did was he put everything. It was a great book because it gives all the agriculture that he came across, all the different towns, all the different things that people did, and especially all the armaments that the communities had. And I'm not sure if France had decided that at some point they will invade California and take it, but they knew exactly where everything was. So this is his map from his 1844 book. And you can see in dead center it says Battery Ruin, which, Veronica, could you say that in French for us? Battery Ruin. Somebody else had it over here. Thank you. We have it in stereo now. So that tells us that fortification was still there, but it was in ruins. The middle piece that says Magazine de Carrillo means leather shop, and so that's where the Mission Fathers had their hide house for the hide and tallow trades. And you can see above that the Presidio is in ruins. So even by 1844, it was pretty much a defenseless town. And this picture here at the far bottom left, you can see that little scar on the hillside there. That's the dirt embankment where the cannons were. So this picture is from about 1926, 27. So that scar was still there. All of that land mass at lower left disappeared in 1941 when they decided to run Cabrillo Boulevard all the way through and up to the new harbor area. At the little point there that's sticking out into the ocean was called Castle Rock. And it was eventually disintegrating, and it had been a great tourist attraction for Santa Barbara, and so it left our site in about 1931. They dynamited it because it was just too dangerous. For a small time, a little piece of that hill was still sticking out behind the bathhouse. For those you old timers that remember the plunge, that was called Fossil Hill, and as kids we would climb it and find all types of little rocks and fossils along there. A place where people go and do things is Bath Street, and at that time, back before we had indoor plumbing, that people would go to West Beach to take their baths. And if you've ever taken a bath with salt water, it's not the best, but it's better than no bath at all. And there was a story from a woman whose father lived in that green area with the adobe on it, which is the Burton Mound adobe. That's where the village of Siuckton was. And she remembered her father going with a rawhide whip and chasing sailors out of the bushes who were watching the women take their baths in the surf. The women were not nude in the surf, but they had on their little white garments, and they would take all their clothes up, put their white garment on, go out into the ocean, get washed, and come ashore. And these guys, the sight of an ankle was enough. You've been at sea for 8 months, an ankle's really darn nice. So also on the Burton Mound, the green area, there was hot springs, there was fresh water, bad water, and sulfur springs. And so the Chumash used it as a place to soak and cure. And so it was also a place where Santa Barbans could also soak in the hot baths and take their baths there. So Bath Street could be because people took their baths in the ocean or because of the nearby availability of hot sulfur water to take a bath. At the same point, that gives us Chapala Street. And Chapala, you can see there was 2 wharves there, and the first wharf for Santa Barbara was at the foot of Chapala Street. And the foot of Chapala Street is just about where all of our other maps showed us the Embarcadero, that showed us a little road. So something was going on there with Chapala Street. All of the histories in Santa Barbara prior to my book say that Chapala was named because a lot of the early settlers came from Chapala, Mexico. Another explanation was that when Governor Micheltorena came to California in 1841, he brought with him a convict army that had been taken from the prisons of Chapala. Getting people to come to California was not always a blessed thing. So many people, if you were a prisoner and you had 4 or 5 daughters at home, you were given free passage to California because we needed women in California, and so your sins were forgiven as a prisoner. So a lot of times they brought prison people up here. Well, Micheltorena, when he was appointed governor, brought a convict army here that everybody hated. So why they would name the street after a convict army, that makes no sense, and especially where it leads to. And also, I did census records and found that there was nobody from Chapala living in Santa Barbara from 1782 up until when the street was named. So that didn't work out. So I was at the Ridley Tree Center, the former McCormick Art Center at Santa Barbara and Arriaga Streets, giving a talk. And when I finished, I was talking to the gardener outside, and we were yakking, and I was telling him some of the Spanish words I was having troubles with and things. And I said, one thing I just don't get is Chapala. It is not in a Spanish dictionary. I can't find anything about it. And he said, Neal, Chapala is not a Spanish word. It's not a Mexican word. It's a Central American word, and it's a native to, for the indigenous people. And I said, well, for God's sake, what does it mean? He says it means to splash or to paddle about. And I went, oh, this is where all the ships, where all the little rowboats landed, so that's where the splashing and paddling and landing came about, so that made sense. Then I found a map that was done by David Banks Rogers in 1926 of the village of Siocton. And notice at the bottom, there's a line that says, a dotted line that crosses the boulevard that says Ancient Cove. And even the Spanish records talk about how much further the cove was at that time than it was as we came into the 1800s and currently into our century. So that made sense. That's where the Chumash landed their tamals, at that nice little cove. That's where the Spanish first landed their rowboats and little supply dinghies. And that also showed up very nicely in 1914 when we had a huge storm, and the ocean, where you can see where the boulevard is at the top right there, and then you can see the piers going down, and that flat land, that is where the cove was. So the ocean went back and reclaimed its cove in what actually is sea level. So Carrillo Boulevard is about 20 feet above sea level. And so it went back and took itself back. And that explains, no one ever notices this, but there is a bend in West Carrillo Boulevard. You can see it here in this picture on the left. You can also see how the water comes in and still tries to reclaim that cove. So this is, again, our 1926 picture. And so that's how Chapala Street got its name, because that's where everybody landed and splashed and paddled about. And now we're going to do 3 for 1. This is the story of El Canon Perdido. And in April of 1848, Santa Barbara was under military rule. The commander was named Francis J. Lippett. He was a very paranoid young man. And just around that time, a ship had wrecked just up the coast a bit from us, about where Hendry's Beach is. And from the shipwreck, there was a cannon. So they brought the cannon back to Santa Barbara, about the only thing they could salvage. They brought the cannon into town. And Lippett said, well, what am I going to do with this cannon? So he decided he would send it up to the capital in Monterey. So he put it down on the beach, waiting for a ship to come up to Chapala Street, I'm sure, and pick up the cannon and take it up to Monterey. Well, at the same time, as it were, some of the Santa Barbarans were getting together and thinking, you know, if we had a cannon, we could take this place. And so when the cannon appeared, they said, there's our chance. So Francisco de la Guerra and a few other guys talked to these young boys, got them all fired up, the 2 Garcia brothers, Pacifico Cota, and another gentleman named Jose Lugo, and got them excited and saying, we got to get this cannon. So they borrowed 2 oxen from a woman named Bernarda Ruiz, who's a phenomenal piece of Santa Barbara history. They borrowed oxen from her, and they went down to the beach, hooked up the cannon, and started dragging it. And they were going to take it to the Cerrito de los Voluntarios, the Hill of the Volunteers. But as they got to where Mission Creek empties, it's just a big marshland between Santa Barbara Street and Anacapa Street. So that whole area was just almost like quicksand. And the oxen wore out, and the cannon was just dragging into the muck. So they decided to bury the cannon there. They then hid their tracks and went back home. The next morning, Lippett wakes up, sees the cannon is gone, and he's furious. He is sure that the Californians are going to cut our throats, are going to kill us. They've got a cannon. So at great expense, he sends a messenger to Monterey, to the governor up there, Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, being this gentleman here. So Mason's of a cooler head, and he goes, you know, everybody's upset. These are troublesome times. So I tell you what, Santa Barbara, I'm going to give you like 2 months to bring the cannon back. And if you don't bring the cannon back, I'm going to fine the community $500 based on your property size. So those of you with bigger property pay more money. Those of you less pay less. But $500 is the fine. Well, the cannon didn't come back. So he levied the fine on the town, but then to sort of make it easier, he brought the military band up from Los Angeles to play at De La Guerra Plaza, and So everybody was happy. They paid their monies, and everything was great. And he said, when the cannon comes back, I will give you this $500, and you can build a jail because you've got a crappy jail here. It was adobe, and basically people would just take rawhide and saw through the bricks and leave. The town figured, great, if somebody leaves the jail, they're not coming back. So, great for that. Well, the Californians thought that this was such great fun after it happened. When they named the streets, the first street that you come across now it's Carrillo Boulevard, but it's Quinientos. And if you look at a map and you see where Quinientos Street is, draw a line and it goes right across where Carrillo Boulevard is. So that was named because that is where the guys dragged the cannon from West Beach towards East Beach along Quinientos. And Quinientos in Spanish is 500. The next street you see is Mason Street. And so the second street you come across is the guy that gave us the $500 fine. They thought that was funny enough to name it for that. Now you think the next street would be Canon Perdillo Street, but it's not. They stuck Canon Perdillo Street way the heck up here between De la Guerra and Carrillo, the two families that masterminded the plot to steal the cannon. But also at the corner of Anacapa and Canon Perdillo Street is the home of the Garcias, the two boys that also assisted. So there's a little thing saying, this street leads to the guys that actually took the cannon. We're the guys that planned it, but there we go. Now, the city also thought it was so good that the first seal for the city of Santa Barbara, which you have here, and you can see the cannon there at the bottom on the beach, and it says, Valle 500 pesos, and that means value $500 or goodbye $500. Now, where's my time counter? How am I doing? You guys want one more street? Yes. Okay. This one is phenomenal. As you know, there are only several man-made objects that can be seen from space. The pyramids of Egypt can be seen from the space station. The Maxim magazine cover that's in the Las Vegas desert that can be seen from space. And the other one that has mystified astronauts and space station people for years is the jog at Mission and De La Vina Street. So how did this happen? Well, we go back to 1786, and there's the mission, and there's the mission garden that was so much mentioned in the plan for Haley that you go up to the edge of the mission garden and start there to lay out your streets. So there's this mission garden, and there's a little blue thing there that was a seasonal stream that ran from Alameda up where it is now Alameda Padre Serra through Emerson and then across where Laguna Street, Garden, etc., along by Mission Street. So in 1786, when they're about to build the mission, the commandant of the Presidio says, we have got to divide the Pueblo lands from the mission lands. And so they're walking around with the two padres, and he comes to where this ravine was, and he says, okay, at this spot, this is where the dividing line will be. And so from where I'm standing, there will be a line straight north to the Sierra, to the mountains, and from the other direction, there will be a line southwest to the pine tree at the place called the Cañada de los Pozos, which is the place of the springs, which we now know as Las Positas. So the tree at this southwest corner is now Hendry's Beach. Some say Arroyo Burro Beach, we say Hendry's. So that's where they were standing. Now, you notice the odd, that angle on that piece of dirt right there. So when Haley did his survey, he went up to that point, which is light green on my little picture here. The dark green is Roosevelt School area, so the lower, lighter green. He went up to that point and said, that's where I'm going to draw my line from. So that was his ending place, and he then drew his line for future Mission Street. And you can see that blue, I colored it all nicely for you. So if you're ever on Alameda Padre Serra, if you look off to the right, you can see this deep ravine that runs behind Plaza Rubio. And so that is the little seasonal creek that used to run there. And Haley didn't realize that he had more land than he actually used for that first block. And so that is why Mission Street goes at an odd angle. The city found out they had all that extra land, and so they added it to 450-foot block 1 and added that triangular piece. And so that's why we have, if you follow Mission Street, it dead ends sort of at Garden, then you make that abrupt left for New Mission Street. And so that's how that came about. But that's not how all this problem happened. So there's the arroyo that This is done about 1874. Edward Hayward took this picture, not realizing that that was the arroyo of the seasonal creek that started all this mess off. And here is the line. When the missions were secularized in the 1830s, the mission lands were then sold off as ranchos, and Rancho Las Positas. And you can see a line there coming up at an angle, sort of towards just a little bit right of center. That's the boundary line of Rancho Las Positas. And it's got a certain degrees and markings, which I'm not going to bore you with. But here, when Haley laid out his street, so you can see where Haley's squares are, nice and neat, the red line through it is the actual boundary line of Rancho Las Positas. But because nobody had fences and nobody had walls, nobody really cared. So Haley put his stakes in, said, here's Mission Street. And then as Rancho Las Positas started getting sold and subdivided, people are going, wait a minute, I've got 25 feet of land that's sticking into the middle of Mission Street. So they had to start readjusting. And so if you look at the maps of the blocks with measurements, you will find that each block, as it starts at Laguna Street and goes over towards Robin Street, starts going less and less, from 450 feet to 440 feet to 438 feet, 425, all the way down. And so when they made the adjustments to get land back for Las Positas, that little green box you see there is De La Vina and Mission Street, and so that's where they started compensating for the land toss. Now I know what you're saying. Wait a second, Neal. I go to Hendry's Beach. You go up State Street all the way to Las Positas. You're way the hell out of town, and then you go all the way down to the beachfront, and you're winding along. There's no way that Mission Street points to Las Positas. And so there we look at the city of Santa Barbara, and at bottom center you can see the Mission, and you can see a little bit of the crooked line, that's Mission Street. Let's see if I can do this, Emily. There it is, there it is, there's Mission Street, and there's this line heading up, Mission Street. And then we gotta go way the heck over here to get to Las Positas. And so you're right, yeah, that doesn't line up. However, if you draw a line like I did, Mission Street runs straight over to the Cañada de los Pozos, so that follows the line that caused Mission Street to be offset. And I didn't believe it until I finally drew the lines and got the map out. And so we'll leave our happy little lines of Las Positas, the offset at De La Guerra, or De La Vina and Mission Street, and now you know why that happened. And we'll close the show off for tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm our Director of Education. We have time for 2 questions. And then afterwards, Neal will be outside signing copies of his book, Street Names of Santa Barbara, that is for sale. And you can go haggle him outside with wine that we're still serving. Okay, I see a question over here.
I have 2 questions. Okay, Salisbury-Haley means get out if you can. Why? And the second question is, De La Guerra comes along here and makes a little side bend. Why?
De La Guerra makes the bend because Octaviano Gutierrez, who got Gutierrez Street named for him, as the Haley survey was going on, he was building an adobe that stuck out into the street, and he knew full well at the time his adobe he was building was going to stick out into the street, but he did it anyway. And there was also a very important bar at the corner of State and De La Guerra Street, and it stuck out into the new street. And so rather than destroy both adobes, unlike all the other adobes, about 25 adobes got demolished because of the streets. But those 2 ones were so important that they moved De La Guerra Street 25 or 30 feet to protect Octaviano Gutierrez and to keep the bar open for everybody. Salisbury-Haley. I'm glad that you asked. I've got these little pictures here just for the fun of it. Okay, Salisbury-Haley gets its name because they said that back in the day, I'm going to go back up. Okay, there we go. There's Salisbury Street in Brown. And you can see the estero below the green thing. That was the 2 green things are the parks that they had originally put for Santa Barbara. And 1851, they put a lot of parkland in, and then later on they sold it off. But so there's a park. Below it, you can see the estero, and the estero was generally fed from the rains during the winter runoff, and so it would fill the lower east side. And so the story about Salisbury, if you read most of the histories, it says it's because it was so mushy and muddy. It was, if you went there, it's Try to get out if you can, hence Salisbury-Haley. So I, being the person that I am, I go to the maps, I look at the drawings. These maps were made in winter when the Estero would have been at its fullest, and none of them go up to Salisbury Street, except that one little spot up there towards the left of center. And what you do see that I circled there, that is what is now Peabody Stadium. And you know that Peabody Stadium from Anapamu, it drops down about 60 feet to the stadium. If you're a Santa Barbara High School graduate, you know that you went down the stairs to go to the stadium. And if you're up on the other side, coming down the back way, you drop down. So it was a box canyon. And it was filled, there was a stream, two streams that went through the box canyon. So I'm saying that is the Salisbury, because if you went in there, you'd have a hard time getting out. So that's my definition of where Salisbury is. And just for funsies, I made these comparison maps. And you can see on the right side there are a number of streams that were seasonal streams that did cross. So you had to have about 7 diversions if you walked along Salisbury Street. You go down into the ditch, back up again, down into the ditch. But still, you could get through pretty darn easy. But you can see at the top of the one on the right, you can see the stream in the bottom of what is now Peabody Stadium. So that is why I say Salisbury is the Peabody Stadium, is the real reason that the street got named. Now, Salisbury Street does continue past Peabody Stadium, and it leads to St. Francis Hospital, or it used to be St. Francis Hospital. And the long-told story was that when the nuns were building St. Francis Hospital in the 19s, they were going to call it Salisbury Hospital because the street was there. And then someone said, "Sisters, Salisbury means..." So I had been talking to Sister Bowman up at the St. Francis Hospital back when it was there, and I was talking to her about the story, and she said, "Neal, we were going to call it St. Francis Hospital." She wrote the history of St. Francis and she's hospital, and she said, "We have the documents. It was going to be called St. Francis." Long before that, there was no Salisbury. And I said, "But sister, it's such a good story." I mean, sometimes when the story is better than the history. I think, isn't that the legend of Liberty Valance, where the newspaper man says that to him? So there's your Salisbury. Now, I had started doing this research on this book. I was going to make a big book of all the street names in Santa Barbara, but it was too big and too expensive, and so that's why I came up with the little pocket history of just the original 52 names. But eventually the full book will come out, and we have so many great fun streets like Curley Avenue over on the west side, 2 blocks long, and I made the mistake one time of joking to an audience that it was named for one of the Three Stooges. And so now that's in somebody's history book, I'm sure. Yeah?
Indio Muerto
Indio Muerto got its name because in February of 1851, as Salisbury-Haley was doing his survey, they came across a deceased Indian. And so that's where they found the Indian. So the Indio Muerto was the place of the dead Indian. And the way I always took it was it's sort of like the tomb of the unknown soldier. No name was attached to who the Indian was. It's just the place of the dead Indian. So in a way, I was kind of thinking like for every Indian that died, a lot of alcoholism was happening in Santa Barbara at that time, or just malnutrition, beatings, whatever it was. I thought, well, this is sort of like the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is named for every Indian that died. But a few years back with the George Floyd revolution, that we had to rename everything in Santa Barbara and other communities. And so Indio Muerto, they had tried to rename it several times. People did, because they didn't know what the meaning was. They said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That phrase came 30 years after the street was named. But they decided that it was now too offensive of a name, so they changed it to Hutash, which is sort of like the heavenly place, the paradise. And so that's how that name got changed. So it did still honor the Chumash in that way. I am pretty sure I know who the Indio Muerto is. I've been going through a lot. It's been 30 years of researching this. And I'm 99.5% sure that he was not a Chumash Indian. He's from one of the southern tribes, but I've got to get up to the state archives and try to find the document that may have that information in it, because reports were always sent up to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so that's where I would find the true answer of who it was, and so we'll find that out. Okay.
I do want to add to that, though, that history is very, very important to our town's history, and the Historical Museum was actually the recipient of Indio Muerto, the street sign, by the city of Santa Barbara in 2020. So we have that here in our collection. Maybe it will be on exhibit one day. That's all I had to add. Thank you, Neal.